In this video, I'm going to show you the two things that you need to understand in order to effectively shoot for the grade. Now, shoot for the grade. What do I mean when I say that? What I'm talking about is the fact that if you are shooting images at a professional level, and maybe even if you're not, your images are going to go through some kind of grading process, likely on a system like the one I'm working with here inside of DaVinci Resolve. So if you can understand that process, if you can understand what's possible, what's easy, and what's difficult in that process, that means you can collaborate better with that process while you are still on set, and in doing so, arrive at your ideal outcome more consistently, which is, of course, to get the strongest possible image. And the strongest possible image is about a handshake, about a collaboration between what happens in camera and what happens in the grade. So I want to show you two practical principles that you can use for more effectively shooting for the grade. Okay, let's dive into Resolve here. And the first principle that I want to talk to you about is the idea that you don't want to be doing things on set that can be done more easily or more quickly in the grade. Let me give you an example of this. Let's take a look at this shot. I'm just going to play through it. And I've already kind of got this shot on its feet. If we check out the timeline level of my node graph here, where I've got my output transform of my color management, I've got a look in place here that is applying some creative preferential manipulation of the image. And I've also gone ahead and done some basic primary grading here as well at the shot level. But let's take a look at the shot as it stands right now and observe something that might indeed stand out to you if you were gathering this image, if you were seeing it on your monitor on the day. And that would be what I'm seeing in the kind of like lower right-hand corner of the frame here. Whatever this little bit of light is that's hitting this surface. I don't know if it's a windowsill or a table surface or what it is, but you might look at that and say, like, I'd like to control that. I feel like it's grabbing my eye. It's distracting me from the subjects and from the center of the frame. And I want to get some control in and knock that down and slow it down. The thing is, that's going to take you longer than it is going to take me. It's a simple 2D manipulation that I can very easily make right here inside of my color corrector with a power window. And even if you're really good at this and you've got a really efficient team in place, it's going to take you longer to get dialed in than this is taking me right now. Okay, so that's one practical example of avoiding doing things on set that are going to be done more quickly or more easily in post-production. By skipping those things, by having the discipline to say, like, yeah, that's kind of bugging me, but that's something that I know I can deal with better or more efficiently in the color grade, you're freeing yourself up to prioritize things that I may not be able to help you with as readily, or whomever you're grading with might not be able to help you with as readily. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute here as well. That's one really good example of something that you can do or rather not do and save for the color grade, and it's going to allow you to free up your time and focus on other things. Let's take a look at this next shot here for another example of this same principle. Don't do things on set that you can do more easily in post. I want to go to my camera raw controls right now in my project settings. And if you look here in my project settings for red, this is an image that was gathered on a red. Right now I have this tint camera metadata checkbox turned on. This simply means pass along whatever tint settings were done in camera into the image as it's being viewed right now. So it allows me to see what the operator had their tint set to when they were on set. So here's like the second example that I want to give to you of things that you can safely just let go of and free up to do other things with that time. Setting your tint in your camera raw controls, whether you're in a red or any other cinema camera that has a tint option, just leave it turned off. I'm going to show you why in just a second here. But another good example would be applying any kind of curves in camera. That's something that is going to be much easier for your colorist to do than it is for you to do. It's going to be easier, it's going to be faster, they're going to be able to get better results than you can get by spending time doing that in camera. And I'll give you the spoiler alert, most of the time I prefer to have this turned off. I will usually tell the cinematographer if I'm doing that, but usually turning this off will allow me to get to a better foundation so that I can balance the image with the full context and the full tool set available to me here in my color grade. So let's just take this shot as an example. I'm going to turn this tint control off, and you can look at the image. You can also look at my vector scope here and watch what happens. The image instantly looks better. Our scope is now, our signal on our scopes rather, are hitting more along this kind of like skin tone line and less into the magenta region. And what I would say in terms of like making a best guess of what happened when this image was gathered is there's mixed lighting in play, and the camera operator is looking at whatever monitor, whatever image they're seeing and saying, oh, I feel like it just needs a little something. And they're moving their tint around until they get something that feels better to them. There's nothing wrong with that, except that I think it was time that could have been better spent on something else. So as you saw, it's not that it's hard to turn off, but your time is precious when you're shooting, and you only want to spend that time on tasks that are going to make a big impact on that final image. And in this case, that's that's something that you've done that really isn't going to make an impact. And in fact, we're going to get a better result by stripping it off and by simply going and using my native tool set to balance the image and get it into an appropriate place. Maybe something like that, okay? So that's a second example of this same principle. Don't do things on set that are actually going to be done better or more quickly or more easily in your color grade. Second principle I want to share with you is kind of the opposite of that first principle, and that is don't avoid things, don't skip things, don't miss things that really can't be dealt with as effectively when it comes time to do the color grade. There's things like that as well. The biggest one that I'm going to call out right away is exposure. That's something that we can do things about, we can sweeten, we can adjust, we can deal with when we're in the color grade, but your exposure choice of where to park your exposure, how to expose your frame, that's one of the most important things that you can nail in camera. That's going to be a really good predictor for how strong things are going to come out at the end of the process. So in contrast to these first two examples, that's something that you don't want to put off until the color grade, because it's really going to be defined in your camera negative, and there's far less that I can do with your exposure than you can do with your exposure on set. Let's take a look at an example here. If we look at this shot, what's happening right now is something that happens a lot in color grading. If I go over to the timeline level of my node graph here, and I turn off my look for a second, remember I mentioned I've got this creative look in place. Oftentimes we're not shooting with a creative look. If we're not shooting underneath a custom LUT, maybe you're shooting underneath a camera manufacturer's default transform. When that's happening, you're going to see something that looks more like the image that we're looking at right now, which might feel moody and a little bit under, but maybe it's okay. Generally speaking, here's a really good rule of thumb for the way this process is going to go from gathering all the way to grading through to finishing your image. Your contrast is typically going to go up along that journey. It's rarely going to go down. So what happens when that contrast goes up and you add a look like this one that I just had in here? Now that image that felt kind of moody and under feels really under and really compromised. And as I said, it's not that there's nothing we can do about this. I can absolutely get in and expose it up and then say, well, now that I've exposed it up and my subjects are looking good, that window is getting really hot, so we need to pull that down. But that's creating an interaction in my midtones that I need to counteract, and that's creating an interaction or a side effect in my shadows that I need to deal with. So this is going to be a finessed thing that's going to take me time to get to, and it's going to take us time if we're working together to find the right exposure and contrast ratio to adjust things to make it feel better. So maybe that's a good start there, but that's probably not everything that we're going to need to do to get to where we all really, really like what we're seeing. That's something that would have been far better handled on set by either bringing in more fill light, opening up the lens, slowing down the light that's coming in through that window, or some combination of all the above, or even other strategies that I'm not thinking of off the top of my head, because spoiler alert, I'm not a DP. I'm better at this than I am at your job. But if you're thinking about things in this way, this is one of the most important things that you can focus your time on set, is really, really nailing your exposure, because my ability to nail your exposure after the fact is way lower than your ability is to nail it right in camera. Okay, so that's a first example of something that you really want to make sure you do well on set, because I can't do nearly as good of a job of it after the fact here in the color grade. Okay, last example and thing that I want to look at here that I can't do nearly as well here in the color grade. And this really bleeds into the second example or point that I want to make within this larger theme of making sure you're doing the things that really matter in camera. Another thing that you don't want to save or leave off for the color grade is what I'm going to call defining the image. So remember in the example that we just did here, I mentioned oftentimes we're not shooting underneath a custom LUT. We're shooting underneath some sort of stock manufacturer transform that doesn't really represent what we're going to want to do in the color grade. And when we're working in this way, what we're doing is we're really failing to define the image. We're leaving that off for later and saying, well, when we get into the color grade, that's where we're going to add this preferential contrast. That's where we're going to add the color palette that we want to see. That's where we're going to shape the image. We can see here on this shot, same kind of thing. If we go back over to our clip level and just scrub through here, you know, if I turn off our overall look, it's a very different looking image than with this look turned on. So another thing that you don't want to leave off, another thing you don't want to overlook in camera because it can't be done as well after the fact, is defining your image. The image should be defined on your terms, and it should be defined at the moment of capture, not after the fact, if it's possible to do that. So just as a concrete example, if you're looking at this shot here, let's just imagine that you were monitoring this, kind of like we gave our example of a moment ago. If you're monitoring this, you're probably looking at the image going like, well, I'm going for a moody vibe. It looks pretty good, right? But if you were monitoring this, you're going to look at that image and you're going to make different decisions. Assume for a moment that we like this overall look here, but within this overall look that we like, you're going to make different decisions. Specifically, you're going to make different exposure decisions when you've got this higher contrast rendering of your image happening here. It's going to cause you to make different choices on set. That's the primary reason why you don't want to hold off on or kick the can down the road with defining your image. That should happen prior to images even being gathered. That should happen either when you're setting up your viewing transform that you're going to be using, or when you're working with your colorist to set up that viewing transform, so that by the time you're looking at images on your monitor, you are seeing the image rendered in the way you intend to see it rendered. And in doing so, you are defining your image at the point of capture, as opposed to waiting to define that image until after the fact. So that's my second example for you of things that we want to do in camera rather than saying, I'll deal with that later in post. So I hope that's some helpful guidelines for you of things that I think we could focus way less on in camera, or that you could focus on way less in camera, and things that you could prioritize more highly when you're capturing your images in camera in order to get the strongest possible result and to get that handshake between what you do in camera and what happens in the color grade in order to get the strongest possible version of your image.